Hey everybody, it's Bust with our patch notes review for the 4.4 patch. This is the balance patch for Glory for Navori, and let's go ahead and jump on in. And so before we talk about the cards, I will say the devs did a preview stream, a dev stream over on Twitch yesterday, 2 days ago as this video was released, and that's very informative and enlightening if you'd like to check that out as well. It's over on the main Play Runeterra Twitch page, and they talk about a lot of these changes that happened and the development reasons for doing so. But I'll deliver my own hot takes here, and let's move on in and talk about some of these cards. And so, first and foremost, we have a fairly reasonable update to the Nightfall package. So Cygnus, the Cloven Way, and now the Moondreamer becoming a Nightfall kind of card. And I think this is kind of interesting, not in the sense of these cards. These cards are all still garbage. But as the set was released and you're following around on various social media, you'll see people kind of asking, why did you gut Nightfall so hard? Why did you leave Nocturne but you removed a lot of the package? Why is Diana still here but you removed like half of the Nightfall cards? And I think Riot, up to this point has been not sneaky. Sneaky's not the right word, but they tend to make these changes with the future in mind, and they can't really say, no, we're taking out all these Nightfall cards because we're going to release a bunch of new ones 6 months from now, right? You can't just come out and say that. That really spoils the fun for everyone, but they've historically kind of incrementally done things like this and made these small changes kind of up front, and then had a big change come in the future. If you remember, like 6 months ago, they had all of the changes to Recall and Kennen and all that stuff, and then the next set came out and there was a big Recall component attached to it. I feel like much of the same thing is about to happen with Nightfall. Now, whether or not that is in an upcoming variety patch or in a big set, or even maybe 2 sets away, I have no way to tell. But I think that this is just a bit of setup for some more Nightfall stuff to come in the future. And so, as I mentioned, these cards are all still garbage. Cygnus is just too expensive for a low impact effect. Giving an ally elusive tends to be a nice kind of OTK styled ability, but there isn't really that big singular build around unit in Targon that really needs this kind of effect. And so your kind of go tall strategies in Targon tend to be things like Pantheon. Pantheon easily enough gets elusive on his own and doesn't need to play bad cards like this. And so what you typically see out of big game ending Nightfall units from Targon is you just play the Winding Light. And so Cygnus has a lot of competition, and I don't feel like these nerfs really help in the way that he needs help. Up next, we have the Cloven Way. Again, another card made cheaper, which makes a little bit more sense for this kind of thing, having the stun component attached to it, but falling from 4 health to 3 makes this card just complete garbage. I think that if this costs 4 mana for a 4/4, or even 4 mana for a 3/4, it might find itself playable, but that 3 to 4 health breakpoint is such an important spot to hit in the game that I don't feel like this really fixes anything that Targon is missing. There aren't enough overwhelms to really generate the big overwhelm strategy, and there aren't any stun cards to deal with the stun. It just doesn't have enough merits on its own, and it's really kind of half-assing its way across the board. And so another bit of a turd, if you ask me. And last but not least, the Moondreamer. It gets the new effect now that if you play it with Nightfall, you reduce the cost of the invoked card by 1. And again, I don't think that this is really anything that's lacking in Targon. The Invoke decks just don't exist, and making this Nightfall effect attached to Invoke just doesn't really do enough. And so I think that, if we do look towards the future, and Riot does leave additional Nightfall cards, then these things might find their way into relevance as far as Constructed is concerned. If you're able to say, well, I'm playing a Nightfall deck, and now I get this extra effect, that's kind of nice. That's that and factor we talk about with a lot of cards, to where they need to do one thing and do something else to generate enough value to be worthwhile in your deck. If this is really tied in with Nightfall, to where you have a Nightfall unit and some utility, or you have a Nightfall unit and a late game finisher in Moondreamer, then you're really starting to talk about something interesting. But none of these cards really synergize well with Diana. None of them really synergize well with Nocturne, and there's just not enough build around component for the Nightfall cards to be quite worthwhile. And so again, 3 months down the road, if we get a new set has a big Nightfall component to it, these cards might be useful. In terms of the current meta, none of these are going to see any play. Up next is our Targonian Tellstones. This is Reddit's #1 choice for the most broken card in the game now, the most ridiculous thing to come out of the new set, so you absolutely should know right from the start that this card is trash. And, you know, it's certainly an upgrade from the previous stances. The ones that had like Wish and Paddle Star attached to it were just complete and absolute garbage, and so this one isn't nearly that bad, but this isn't anywhere near that level of strength that Reddit is really trying to push forward on this. I struggle to see any deck that really wants to play this. We are entering into a meta to where Varus is becoming really popular. Pantheon is starting to make the rise on the coattails of Varus, and having access to Hush is a very powerful ability in this format. But I would say that 95% of the time you would rather just play Hush because you don't really care about having Behold the Infinite or Blessing of Targon. And the thing that's really kind of ties into this and needs to make itself known is it's a 4-mana Hush just is not playable. It's so important in these games to be able to cast these interactive combat spells solely on the basis of spell mana, and not being able to play the Targonian Tellstones into Hush based solely on spell mana makes this pretty bad. And so there is some kind of world to where this will be a one-of copy in some deck. There's a world where Seraphine moves into Targon, and now she wants to have this double spell generating card. I'm not saying that there aren't decks that will play one copy of this, but on the whole, the Targonian Tellstones is still trash, and it's not going to see play. Up next, we have the updates to the Ascended package. And so Azir takes one less ally to flip. Nasus comes down with an additional +1/+1. And, you know, this helps. We actually just played Azir Lucian in our most recent video and just got absolutely shit stomped the whole way through. And this one bonus level up on Azir isn't really going to be changing anything in the terms of that deck, but it's these little incremental advantages that take the deck from being a 50 to 51% win rate deck up to a 52 to 53%, and that's what makes all the difference in the world in terms of having decks rise up the meta tier lists. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more further down the road, but in terms of these cards, I honestly haven't played enough Sundisk and the like to really determine how much this matters. It certainly makes those decks better, but it doesn't make them better enough that I really want to kind of dive in and start playing Sundisk with Azir, playing Sundisk with Azir, Nasus Renekton, or even looking towards things like Nasus Kindred style decks. These small incremental upgrades aren't quite enough. If these were decks that were on the fringe of playable and then catching an upgrade now, then these would be much more impactful. But in the current state of things, I don't think this is going to change anything either. And so we'll see. I've been really interested in the Sundisk in the current meta, given that it should just absolutely annihilate Karma Set and those really slow kind of grindy decks. The Sundisk should be the deck that comes in and just really crushes them, but the loss of Zerath has been pretty big. And so I'm curious to see in that context if the Sundisk can't improve a little bit, but in terms of the decks that currently exist, none of them want either of these cards. And in terms of new decks, I'm not certain that anything really develops out of this. Could have some interesting implications in Eternal, though, as units like Azir fitting into decks like Tokens makes it much more interesting. And that having your Azir flip with one less ally is a pretty big hit in Eternal, and so maybe it will see some updates there. The last of the Ascended package is Glory's Call, catching a buff from 6 mana down to 5. This is one of these cards, I thought it cost like 9. But I'm still not entirely certain what would make me want to play it. It's not terrible at 3 mana, right? So it costs 2 less for each different Ascended ally you've played this game. So you play your Azir, now it costs 3. It's not a terrible deal. It really just depends on how strong the cards are in the Emperor's deck. And so spending 3 mana for a draw 2 is about the price you pay in Runeterra. You're typically paying about 4 for a draw 2, and so a draw 1 cycle kind of card is probably priced about right at 3 mana. But it depends on what you're really looking to hit out of the Emperor's deck, and if you have the time for this kind of thing, right? If you have all the time in the world, then cards like Glory's Call tend to be okay. on turn 7, you have to really decide if you're willing to spend 3 mana on something that could give you a good card draw or not. And so I don't think that this is what the decks were really lacking, but it is inching closer and closer to playability, even though I still think it's going to be pretty unplayable in the competitive scene. It's a little odd when it costs 6, you can copy it with Jace, right? That's not possible anymore, and so it's no good. Now, the first one I'm not going to talk trash on the rest of the way here is Soul Harvest, and so the picture isn't up as we look at the Riot provided patch notes, but the champion killing portion of it has been reduced in cost from 4 down to 3. And as we were just talking about with Targonian Tellstones, this is a really big deal. Anytime you can cast a spell for 3 spell mana, it's just so much better than when you could do it for 4. And that's like the nerf to Oblivion point we've seen for a lot of cards across the course of the game, is whenever you're able to play something like for 3 mana, it's incredibly powerful since you can bank all of that mana. As soon as it runs up to 4, it just becomes unplayable. And I feel like the only card across the course of the game that has survived that transition from 3 mana to 4 have been ridiculous. And so Deny currently sits at 4 mana, isn't in danger of any future nerfs, I don't think. The only other one that's gone from 3 to 4 would, I believe, would be Relentless Pursuit, which was nerfed again and then nerfed again and then nerfed again. I think Relentless Pursuit's been nerfed like 4 times at this point. And so outside of those two, everything else doesn't really seem to make it. Nobody's playing standalone anymore, and it's just that breakpoint is such a huge and critical point that it's tough to overcome. And so now as we're going back the other way, right, as we're going from 4 mana to 3, Soul Harvest really kicks up in power, and this is something that that Shadow Isles should really be looking towards in generating some of these control decks, in the sense that you now have access to Quietus, you have access to a good Soul Harvest at 3 mana to kill the champion or 2 mana to kill the smaller unit, and it's something that's realistically going to make an impact. The first one making an impact on the meta, and I'm really curious as the next Shadow Isles champion gets released, whatever that one would be and whatever its support package is, that's when I think you'll really see this Soul Harvest start to pop off. And so Shadow Isles has been kind of non-existent this patch. There's a little bit of things like Heimerdinger Jace running around, and a little bit of things like Nora Heimerdinger and Nora Vagar, but for the most part, Shadow Isles hasn't received much love since the rotation, since there weren't any real Shadow Isles cards in the new set, minus things like Soul Harvest, and once those new sets come out, I think it'll really pop off. Up next, we have Cadrigen, giving your dragons +4/+4 instead of +2/+2, and I don't think it's that interesting. My spot with Cadrigen is you never actually played it in your own deck. This was something that you just ended up generating off of other cards, and anytime you generated it and played it, you just won the game anyways. And the thing that was making Cadrigen not good wasn't that he wasn't generating enough stats. You could have Cadrigen give all of your dragons like +10/+10, and it would probably still feel like the same card. The thing with Cadrigen and his problem is it doesn't have Overwhelm Elusive, it doesn't rally, it doesn't have any way to punch through the opposing board. And so if Cadrigen comes down and gives all of your other dragons +10/+10, you're playing 19/19 Shyvanas or whatever it is, your opponent's still able to just block with a 1/1 and not take any damage. That is the real problematic point you have with Cadrigen, is you're making this gigantic mana investment in a real late game unit. There's no guarantees that that late game unit can even proceed past a 1-drop. And so again, not something I really see to expect to make an impact on the meta. Cadrigen wasn't played before, he's not going to be played now. His problem isn't his ability, his problem is his lack of Overwhelm or Elusive. Up next, we have the Priestess of the Desert. Everybody's still just trying with this one, right? And so the champion that gets drawn now gets +2/+2. I'm assuming that Riot fixed the bug with this thing as to where when it was initially released, you didn't have to have 6 different champions. You could just play your champions as normal, and this would still just come down and summon them. And even with that being the case, the card was no good. And so I think we're going to see a very similar pattern with the Priestess of Desert Light here, as to where even when the Priestess was in that high-powered mode, it wasn't good enough. The summoning of the champions wasn't the limiting factor. It was playing a 6-mana do-nothing unit that has to survive to the next turn to then potentially maybe have something good happen. And as we see, these units that cost 6 mana and 7 mana and don't do anything just don't do enough. And so If you're looking to play, a loyal Badger Bear as a early game do nothing unit, that's pretty fine. But as you're really pushing yourselves up the curve, those do nothing units just need to have a monumental amount of stats to make up for their lack of impact to the board. And the Priestess doesn't really cover that space. Up next, Mirror Image, another buff to this. And so people always say you can't have a set of Riot patch notes without buffing the reputation mechanic, and LeBlanc being the reputation champion of choice, catching a buff in this patch. And so this lets you now pick any ally instead of just a 5 power plus ally, which is just all upside, right? And so there weren't too many cheaper units who were looking to really copy with Mirror Image, right? All of the really strong ones you would be copying with Mirror Image were like Ash for the Frostbite, or you would hit Avarosian Hearthguard for the unit boosting to your deck, or you'd hit Revna to draw the unit and stuff. And so those were all fine. You typically were only hitting smaller units out of desperation, right? And so, or that's what I would say you're going to be doing now, is hitting smaller units out of desperation. And so it's nice to be able to do it. I don't think anyone's ever going to be like, wow, I'm so excited to mirror image my Omen Hawk, but having the ability to do it certainly makes the card better. And so a little bit more upside for LeBlanc, as her friend does get nerfed a little bit in this patch. On to the next piece is Bandle Gunners, and this is the one I'm most interested in trying out and seeing how it works out. And so this has been completely reworked. It now costs 10 mana, and then it costs 1 less for each multi-region ally you've summoned this game. Then it also has Spell Shield and Impact 3. And the thing that this immediately reminded me of is if you go to Hearthstone. I don't know if anyone played Hearthstone when Corridor Creeper was at its prime, but it was initially like a 6-cost 5/5. Maybe it was a 7-cost 5/5. It was definitely a 5/5 for the longest time. And then over the course of the games, you typically played it for like 1 mana in the later turns of the game, or you could have these really nice curves to where you would start churning them out on like turn 4. And turn 4 was much too fast for having a card with that stat line. And so this is one of the most obnoxious cards, at least in terms of high-powered units went in terms of Hearthstone, and that is what strikes me as kind of the immediate parallel to Bandle Gunners. And so I don't think Bandle Gunners is going to be quite that level of obnoxious as to where you're able to play it for like 3 mana pretty regularly. But if you're able to, put a price point on this, what are you willing to pay? Would you be willing to pay 5 mana for a 5/5 impact Spell Shield? That's not a bad deal, right? It doesn't have Overwhelm, but it does have Impact, and Spell Shield is a pretty relevant ability. And so if it's going to be any less than that, you're looking pretty good. And so we'll see. This is one of these cards that doesn't have to see the units come into play. And so if you draw it on turn 9, it should just be pretty close to free at that point. And it's not something to where it needs to be drawn in your hand at just the right time to start getting these bonuses. And so I'm curious. It does fit in nicely with the current theme of Tristana paired into Noxus and getting those really high attack power units and then playing Might on them. And so I'm curious to see if the Bandle Gunners can't make the rollover into relevance now. Also interesting, if you're not playing it physically in your deck, this is a card that can this get generated by Bandle City Mayor? No, it can't. Bandle City Mayor generates he generates the multi-faction units. You would have to use Paparo to generate this guy. But I was like, oh man, that does sound kind of sick. if you don't even have to play the Gunners and then you could just generate it with the Mayor, that would be nice. But we'll see if this one makes the cut. Up next, we have Advanced Intel. It costs 2 mana instead of 1, but it also cycles now, so it draws whenever you play it. And this does push it into the lands of relevance. Now, most decks aren't willing to play a card just because it cycles, right? This isn't reason enough to play a card. You don't want to say, oh boy, this thing is so free, we can just include it inside of any deck now. That's not really going to be the case, but it does make a strong argument to now fitting within Caitlyn decks, to now fitting within Teemo decks, since Teemo can kind of get double usage out of it with the Puffcat Peddlers. But the place I think that this would probably just start to land is going to be in decks like Seraphine, as to where it's already in P and Z. It's a 2-cost card, so it can be generated in terms of Seraphine. She can then play it and cycle it, give you a little bit of defense, and then if she is flipped and you get to play it as a draw 2, that's a pretty good deal. And so now, granted, I wouldn't play nasty and dirty decks like like Seraphine with anything, but I could definitely see advanced intel fitting into something like that, to where it has multiple synergies across what you're doing. And so we'll see if this one comes in and starts to make an impact. Also, kind of interesting with this is you can't generate it with coral creatures anymore, or you can't generate it with the Mr. Thunder. Is it Mr. Thunder? I can't remember his name. The 2/1 elusive, the new guy out of the new guy out of Bilgewater, the elusive thing. We'll just call him Mr. Thunder now, but he also generates a 1-cost card, and it's kind of interesting taking what was generally a turd. Right, you weren't really excited to generate advanced intel in those decks. It could be somewhat useful because you could have the burst spell to protect your Fizz with, but this wasn't a real high impact card. But now that it's been removed from the choices there, does give those units a bit of a boost. Down here, we have Deathless Knight, still garbage. Everything we've said about all these other do-nothing units applies to the Deathless Knight. It doesn't have Overwhelm, it doesn't have Elusive. Fearsome doesn't quite do enough in terms of late-game closing capabilities, and just a 5-mana do-nothing unit doesn't really have much business in the game. Up next, you could potentially make an argument for Retired Reckoner. This was a guy that made a bit of an impact in Expedition, when you could be in the space of playing Riven decks and having a lot of ways to come out and generate Reforges, but you didn't necessarily have a lot of Rivens in your deck. If you're at the beginning of the Expedition, you only had 1 copy, and you needed something to kind of come in and close out the game that also synergized with the rest of your abilities. Retired Reckoner kind of fits in that spot. And so I don't think he's quite enough to where he's going to bridge the gap and make the crossover. With Varus being so popular and powerful right now, you don't really need another card with this kind of ability because Varus just does it so well. But this is the kind of card that could potentially start to bridge that gap. And so getting this extra stat point to have 3 attack naturally is pretty big. Again, 3 health is the break point that you really need to be able to kill these early units, and I could see him getting a little bit stronger now, but I don't think he's going to be making the cut. Down into the Nerfs section. And so I think this has been a pretty reasonable collection of Nerfs across the board. Ashe goes up from 4 to 5 Frostbites in terms of getting her flipped. I think this is reasonable. I felt like Ashe was flipping a little bit too early, especially given how powerful her ability was and the limited ways to interact with the big unblockable mess coming at you. And so I don't think this is enough to take Ashe out of the meta. You might have to build a little bit more towards the Frostbite themes, and you're not going to get nearly as many of those games to where you just blow out the opponent on turn 6. But she should still be playable. I think she's going to be fine. In terms of the Reckoning, this is a little bit tougher, right? Pushing your removal spell 1 turn further into the future is a pretty big deal. And so we'll see if Reckoning, makes it. It's also, a pretty meta-dependent card as to how many copies of the Reckoning you want to play. And so I think these, big board sweepers are so good coming out of the Reputation decks that there's certainly a place for them. It's just a matter of whether or not the format is unit-centric enough for this kind of ability to matter. Up next, hard to see, but one of the biggest nerfs in the set, All Out, now only gives +1 health if you've done damage for the round. And so it does 2 damage +2 attack all the time. If you're plundered, it gives the +1 health instead of the +2. And so, yeah, I was a bit surprised to see this to be the only real nerf to Samira. I was expecting her to be a little bit more challenging to flip, or the rally a little bit harder to obtain. Didn't see any of that, just the nerf to All Out, the only thing directly affecting her. But she's definitely much weaker on the defense now. And then the ability for All Out is going to be a little bit weaker across the board. And so this is another one. It doesn't feel like a particularly major change, especially when you think in the sense that the majority of the time you're making your attacks with All Out and you aren't using it defensively. And so your units like Samira and Varus already have Overwhelm. If you're using it on something like Fizz or one of your elusive units, it's typically just to dodge a removal spell that you were only needing 1 health to survive anyways, but it's definitely weaker, and it's going to be a little bit of a small percentage cut into Samira. Up next, I love the update to Wiggly Burblefish, making it cost 8 mana, just sending it up to the land of ridiculous costs, right? And so we were talking quite a bit about our Bandle Gunners and their ability to come down cheaply. Wiggly Burblefish is most certainly easier to cheapen up. There's a load of ways to get all of these spells generated, but I felt like this card was fairly unhealthy across the board, and none of the decks that were playing it were particularly fair or fun style decks. And so having this guy be a little bit slower to come down, I think is all around generally pretty good for the meta, and we'll see if the Burblefish decks can still stick. I don't think it's enough to really remove this thing from the format. It tends to really thrive in new formats when the interactivity hasn't really been well defined, and it tends to do well in non-interactive formats to where you can play it with big combo turns on like turn 7 or turn 8, but slowing down that combo for 1 turn can really make all the difference in terms of leading this card around. Up next, we have Inferna. She drops from 5 health to 4. Pretty relevant to me, at least in terms of a lot of the decks that we play, because she now dies to Jural, the Demacian Darken unit. And so I think this is a card that needed a nerf. It was one that I feel like it was hard for less experienced players to determine how nutso's Inferno was going to be, right? It's like, oh man, you're playing this 4 mana elusive unit that doesn't have much attack. I don't have to worry about that. But they also just don't realize they lose every single game. The opponent untaps with Inferno on the board, and Inferno comes down and just draws the opponent like 7 cards. And it doesn't like immediately strike you as something that kills you if she survives, but it most certainly does. And so hopefully people in the lower end of the talent spectrum will still be able to recognize the strength of Inferna now that she's even weaker, because the people in the top end and up in the master space know that this is certainly a must-kill on-site unit. And so I'm glad to see her nerfed up a little bit. I didn't have any other combos that kind of immediately made relevance to her, but Jural was the big one to me, and a card that was most certainly powerful that needed a bit of a nerf. Up next, we see some big changes to the Daybreak package. This is something that hurts me to see because we've played so much Daybreak over the course of the past 6 months, but something that was probably pretty necessary. And so Leona now needs 5 Daybreaks to activate, and the Sun Guardian lost a point of health. And so the Sun Guardian now comes down onto the board as a 3/3, much, much weaker than it used to be, coming down as a 3/4. Again, that 3 to 4 health breakpoint is such a big deal. And missing out on it with the Sun Guardian, who now trades with random 2-drops on turn 3, is a real bane and a real pain and a real boon to this deck. And so I think the space that we're going to see with Leona and the Daybreak team are, you can't just play the bad ones anymore, right? And so it was pretty obvious and apparent right at the release of the set that Samira Leona was just the absolute best version of this deck that you could be playing. Samira just fits in so well with all of the Daybreak units. They all have high health. You can pass out the challengers on them and really have these board-defining combats to where you get to pick on your opponent's small units with your challengers and then pick on their big units with the stuns. And that was clearly defined to be the best one. But the Daybreak package was so powerful on its own, as we look to formats like Best of 3, you could look to put Samira somewhere else. And so you didn't necessarily have to play the best version. You could play some other version of Samira and then pair Leona off with something like Kale or Jarvan or Garen or whatever, and the Daybreak was still powerful enough to really give you a strong set in the best of 3 lineup. Now, what I'm taking with all of this is I don't think you're going to be able to do that anymore. I think you can still play dedicated high-powered decks like Samira Leona. That kind of deck is going to be fine, but if you're looking at the lineups that I've been playing where we have decks like Leona Garen, that's not really going to cut it anymore because the Daybreak package has lost a lot of its power. And so, again, I don't think it's going to be gone. I think it's still going to be a part of the meta, but the fringe versions of it, the oops, I didn't play as many good cards versions of it, I don't think are going to quite make it. Okay, and so up next we have Karma and some changes to P and Z. So Karma loses a point of health, Caustic Rift costs 1 more mana, but if you're flowed, it still costs 2 to get the AoE, and then Drum Solo on the flow reduces the cost of the cards by 1 instead of 2. And this is a pretty big set of changes. I saw a lot of talk on the Twitter space about how this isn't that big of a deal. Karma losing a point of health doesn't really matter that much, that these decks are still going to pop off in the terms of Karma set. And while I understand that sentiment, that's not entirely how it works. And it's really tough to kind of like feel these changes, right? And so what the thing I kind of propose with this is if we look at the decks in the game, anything under about like a 48% win rate is just not playable, right? If it's a 48% win rate deck, that's where you see kind of stuff like the Sun Disc, to where its matchups are really polarized. It's good against a certain set of decks, it's bad against another set of decks, and you can take it into best of 3 looking to ban out the bad subset. So it's on the whole a 48% win rate deck, but it has times to where it can be good. Then as you push up the win rates, as the deck gets up to 55% win rate, that's where Riot starts to say, hey, this deck is too good, we need to start nerfing stuff in here. And so what this is starting to go towards is, let's just assume that Karma set is a 55% win rate deck, right? And now this change to Karma only affects you in 1 in 100 games, right? In 1 in 100 games, you run into this space to where you have to play Karma on turn 5 as a blocker or whatever. Your hand dictates that you have to play this turn 5 Karma. Now she dies because she has 3 health instead of 4. And so this is a fairly fringe scenario, right? We said it only comes up in 1 in 100 games, but that's what drops your win rate from 55% to 54%. And now we look at something like Caustic Rift. Is it typically that big of a deal? Probably not, right? You get the AoE when you need it. It still costs 2 mana most of the time, but you run into that 1 in 100 games to where you used to win the game, now you lose it because of that difference. And so now, because of the Karma change and the Caustic Rift change, we've jumped from a 55% win rate deck to a 53. Now we want to come down and add in Drum Solo, which is actually a pretty big change in my opinion, and say this drops it a point and a half, right? It's only relevant in 1 in 100 games. In this case, it would be 1 in, oh my gosh, 1.5 in 100 games. that's the math that we're going to use. So overall, this is, kind of piecing together as a 3.5% to the win rate change. Now you're moving from what is a 55% win rate deck in terms of needing a nerf and pushing it down into that space to where it's barely a 50-50 deck, and it starts being a fringe playable in ladder, and it's becoming a best of 3 option only. And so it's tough to really kind of fit all of this together, right? You can play 30 games with your Karma set deck. Those games all take like 15 minutes apiece, so it's probably going to take you like 30 hours to get through all those games. But at the end of those 30 games, you may not have ever encountered a situation to where the Karma point and health drop mattered. But it's still there. It's still 1 in 100. You're not playing too many games to where it's relevant, but it is still relevant. It is still enough to kind of push the win rate on these cards down. And so it's what makes me wonder sometimes is we kind of trashed on the Nightfall cards, we trashed on all the Ascended cards. If that change to Azir is what pushes him 2% up into the better, is that what pushes the Sun Disc from being a 50-50 win rate deck up to a 52% win rate deck to where it starts to being ladder reasonable? And so it's tough to really tell, as these minor changes make really big impacts on the meta. But I feel like it's very short-sighted to say that the change to Karma only having 3 health now doesn't matter. That is farthest from the case, even if it only matters in 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 games. That's a very big update in the grand scheme of things that pushes this deck down in terms of the win rate. But definitely a nerf to Karma, definitely a nerf to Caustic Rift, definitely a nerf to Drum Solo. Are these changes enough to remove them from the format? No. But are they significant enough to really weaken the decks that are riding on the coattails of these cards? Most certainly and absolutely. Up next, we have the Opulent Foyer. It used to generate the token whenever you played it or whenever you got the attack token. Now it only generates it when you summon or at round start when you have the attack token. So a lot of the shenanigans have been removed from the Foyer. Your scouts being cataclysmed and generating multiple tokens on the turn isn't going to be a thing anymore. And so I feel like, at least to me, the usage of Gwen with the scout units was at best like a third deck in a best of 3 lineup. and now I think it probably just gets completely taken off of the table. And so I'm curious to see if things like Sejuani Gwen can't make an appearance and kind of take over that space to where the Scouts version was really taking hold, or if another Noxen version can't come in and get a little bit better usage out of this, right? A lot of the power in these abilities does come from attacking multiple times in the same turn. And so the Scout units aren't going to be completely useless, but without being able to generate power after power after power after power, I think you have to really kind of move up in the strength spectrum and start looking towards things like Sejuani, as to where, just attacking with a bird and then getting to attack again isn't really strong enough when it's not generating those tokens. And so I don't think the Hallowed theme is going anywhere. I think it'll probably still stick around, but I think the deck is going to have to be kind of freshened up a little bit with the foyer not generating nearly as many Hallowed units as it used to. Up next, last one on the list, we have the Ambitious Cultist. The generated spell is only free for a turn. After the turn, it costs 2 mana. And, this is another one that's quite relevant. This is a card I've been playing quite a bit of in Samira Varus, and having that card be free forever is a pretty good deal. And so definitely a weakening to the Cultist package, a weakening to the decks looking to take advantage of this unit, but it's not going to be enough to remove him from the game. Still a pretty powerful ability. If you generate a Mystic Shot and play it now, that's great. If you have to hold on to that for a while, that's fine, but definitely a little bit weaker. And so those were all the cards. Oh, Prank changed. Nobody cares about Prank. I hate the cards that generate Prank so much. We'll just say no one cares about it. And so, no, it limits what it can do now. It only has 2 modes to where it either makes the card cost 2 more, or it gives it -2 attack and vulnerable. It loses out on the -2 attack only and the -1 attack and vulnerable. I think there's still a... what is it? The -1 attack can't block? I think that's still a piece of the puzzle, but I don't know. I don't plan on playing this card anytime soon, so we can just ignore it. And so otherwise, there wasn't too much going on throughout the remainder of the patch notes. I did think this was interesting. They are going to have unlimited entry Ruthless Rumbles so that you can get in multiples in a day. It's kind of tough for me to get in multiples in a day since they tend to take multiple hours to run through. But, if you want to devote your entire Saturday to playing Ruthless Rumbles, you can do it now. I feel like that's a pretty good thing for everyone. The big thing in terms of the matchmaking is it's now based on your match record. And I'm curious to see how this plays out. In terms of how long we have to sit in queue for games, because this does affect things outside of the Runeterra Open. This affects the daily events now as well, and so it should make them much more competitive. But that does have its downsides to it, right? You're going to have to wait longer in queues. I'm curious if the kind of casual crowd starts to drop off with these, right? Because it feels decent if you jump in and you go like 2-2 and you have to drop. You got some wins. You were 50-50 at the end of the day. It doesn't feel that bad. But if you're just starting to get smoked every single round, you just probably won't play the format anymore. And so I'm curious if that's going to tie in either. But all of the competitive players' wet dream has been brought forth with the matchmaking. You should now only be playing opponents with the same, well, it says a similar number of wins, and so if you're 7-0, you shouldn't be playing against someone that's 0-0. Otherwise, Runeterra Open coming up 2 weekends or 3 weekends away from now. We'll look to play in this on May the 13th, and then I thought there was one more change in here. Oh yeah, the LOR turning 3. This is exciting. Now, I can't get away from using the Cupcake emote, the Garen with the Cupcake. I think it was the 1 year or the 2 year anniversary. I can't remember which one it was. But if you don't have that one, you do have the opportunity to come in now. Get this sweet Nora emote with the Cupcake. And you can use that as your cupcaking emote of choice. And so that is going to do it for the video. Agree or disagree with any of our assessments of the buffs and the nerfs and the changes, be sure to let us know. We'd love to hear it. And then that is going to do it for us today. And so I hope everyone enjoyed the video. Hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way and you had a good time watching. So this is Bust and we thank you for being here.